Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. This is a celebration of Dante's 700th anniversary. We're here to talk about him in detail. We have 3 professors here to speak about it. But let me give you a little bit of background first. Of course, it's the 700th anniversary of his death, but it's not that long after the 700th anniversary of his having written the Divine Comedy. Because he died only a few months after he finished it. I think he was very eager to find out whether it was true what he had written. Now we're celebrating other things too, tangentially. This is also the week of the Italian language in the world. The Italian government has designed this. And I have this rumor that I heard that the Italian government actually decided that because we were doing the Dante program this week in San Francisco. But that might be fake news. So it was interesting, somebody pointed out, Teresa Nelson pointed out, that this is also the National Arts and Humanities Month, October is. Now, that would seem like a total coincidence because we didn't really realize this when we planned this, except for that October is also the national month of 110 other things, just in case you didn't know that. And one of those is that it's National Pretzel Month. So that's why we have pretzels out there now. But that shouldn't influence your decision for dinner afterwards. It's also Bat Appreciation Month. You definitely don't want to have that influence your dinner. Now, you won't believe this, but one of the other month this is National Toilet Tank Repair Month. I'm not making that up. I'm really not making that up. As if somebody, I'm just going to wait until October. It doesn't matter whether it's broken or not. And I mention that because this is all in light of what October really is about, because it's National Sarcastic Awareness Month. That's true. All right. So that's what we're celebrating tonight. We're celebrating Dante more than any of the other ones. So this is a great opportunity for Humanities West. Humanities West has been here in San Francisco for almost 40 years now. And so I thought we would say a little bit about the history before we get started so that people had an idea about what Humanities West was. We have about 2,000 or 3,000 people who know us very well in San Francisco, but Humanities West has been around for almost 40 years. It was founded by 3 women. Eleanor Selfridge Field, right, and Elaine Thornburg and Teresa Nelson. Now, they did such a good job at the beginning that the National Endowment for the Arts gave them money, and there were lots of very big programs.
Humanities, not the arts.
Okay, humanities, not the arts. Thank you very much. Spoken by somebody who actually worked for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Signa Hodelin, who I was going to mention just a little earlier, she's responsible for the flowers and has been giving the flowers to Humanities West for many, many years and makes us feel much classier than we actually are. So the history includes so many different programs, and we sort of try to focus on highlights of human history. What really went on that can make you, in our human history, that can make you at least feel vaguely proud of being human. I didn't say that. And one of the things that we learned from having done so many of the programs, because we've done over 100 programs, we do 2-day programs, usually Friday night and Saturday all day. We're doing a very concise version of it for 2 hours today, so don't worry. And what we find about that is that almost everything the human race has achieved has been done in the middle of a political mess. I mean, there's never been a very orderly time at which things happened. It's always been in the middle of a mess. And some people get depressed when they find that out, but you should actually be very optimistic because that means we could probably do something great even in the middle of the current political messes. So that's a little bit about the background. Now I want to tell you a little bit about some of the people who've made this happen because mostly Humanities West has been a volunteer production. There are some people who have been on the board for many, many more than a decade. And we have had other people who've just had a big influence on Humanities West over time. And that's wonderful music to go with our program. It's just a reminder to turn off your phones. I wonder if I did. No, I didn't. So some of the people that have been very influential, Charlie Bowman, Kirk McKenzie, and Kip Krana, who is going to be speaking tonight, all more than a decade of work for us. And Judy Workman, I want to mention, she was on the board at the time that Humanities West had its toughest time in the mid-aughts. And she became the executive director and the chairman of the board and made Humanities West survive to this period of time. I'd also like to mention some of our top executive directors that ran things for quite a few years. Nancy Buffum, Patty Lundberg, and Cynthia Pham Gordon, all of which did a great job producing these programs for us. The pandemic has left us without an executive director for the time being. But we are trying to give everybody an idea about what Humanities West was with this concise program that we're putting together. One thing I would also like to add is that we're already in our second generation of board membership because Andrew Linford, who is the son of the founder, Elaine Thornburg, is on our board and has been for 5 years. So we've been around for a while. You know that when that happens. So that's a little bit about Humanities West and the programs we put on. Now I'll give you a little idea about Dante, just overview. So as I said, he died in 1321, so 700 years ago. And he was very influential in the long run. He was a student of the Italian language, for one thing. He studied all the different dialects. He did a very thorough job of it. He wrote about it, and he was looking ahead saying there should be an Italian language that takes the place of Latin. He didn't say it exactly like that. But like a lot of researchers, it's very important to find this out. I mean, he studied all the different all the different city-states and so on. And in the end, he decided that the Tuscan dialect was the best. Of course, where do you think he was from? So, watch out who you hire to do any project like that. He was, people are familiar a little bit, probably from Shakespeare, about the fight in Florence. He was a Florentine. The fight in Florence between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. I'm sure I didn't pronounce them correctly, but that's the two groups. And as usual, it was a group that was sort of, one was for the Pope and one was for the Emperor. So political versus theological. So at the time that Dante was young, the Ghibellines, he wasn't one of them, were more influential. But then his party took over. Now, what happens when a party takes over and the other party is gone and no longer influential? And how long does it take before that one party splits into two? Well, we're watching it right now in Washington, so we all know how long it takes. But the Guelphs split in two, and there were the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs. And the white Guelphs were all in favor of the Pope, but they didn't think he was perfect. And the black Guelphs were all in favor of the Pope, but they thought he was perfect. Which one do you think the Pope preferred? Just guessing. So the Pope, who was not perfect, and ended up in the deep rungs of hell in Dante's Divine Comedy, he got the white Guelphs to send a group of people to Rome to negotiate with him about that because they were in charge in Florence. And while they were there, he kept them behind and allowed the black Guelphs to take over Florence. And so Dante and his family lost all of his wealth and all of his property and became an exile. One of the reasons he put the Pope in hell. It's an interesting insight into the times, too, the 1200s and early 1300s, that Dante was born, say, 1265, something like that. His mother died when he was around 10. We know that his father died before he turned 18 because he had to sign some documents when he turned 18 that showed that he was already an orphan. He was engaged to Gemma Donati. I'm sure I don't pronounce that name either correctly, but he was engaged to Gemma when he was 12 years old. Now, they had some restraint. They did not get married till they were 20. But that's how, sort of the time frame. But he still, lived well into his late 50s, right? Now, one of the things about, being betrothed at 12 and married at 20, he really didn't love his wife the way he loved Beatrice. I mean, the Divine Comedy is all about this love of Beatrice. But Dante was influenced by the troubadour poetries. And one of the things about this kind of approach to women is that you love them without knowing them. He didn't really ever know Beatrice that well. He fell in love with her when she was 8. I don't know how old he was. And he admired her and chatted with her sometimes. But basically, it's like a high school crush, where you never ever talk to the person until your 50th reunion and find out that, she's a grandmother with 10 grandkids. So, but Beatrice obviously played a big part in the Divine Comedy as well, as an image of pure love. And this kind of troubadourian influence will be talked about a lot by Marissa later on. So our three speakers for tonight are Tim Hampton, professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Kip Cranna, who's a Humanities West stalwart, as I said, and also has been on our board for a long time. And he is the dramaturg emeritus at the San Francisco Opera. And we also have Marissa Galvez from Stanford, where she's a professor. And we're going to start post-Dante and move our way back towards pre-Dante. We're going to go in the reverse order as if we were a Benjamin Button film. So we're going to do this in the usual Humanities West way, one speaker after another, and at the end we'll have a Q&A, but we're going to do this in 2 hours straight, so we're going to try to be concise in order for the pandemic's influence to come on us and have us behave ourselves a little bit. But we don't want to behave ourselves too much. So, Tim, there you are. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, great.
Thank you, George. So good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank Humanities West and Commonwealth Club for inviting me to share my thoughts this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and also an honor, given the quality of programming that Humanities West has brought to the Bay Area over the past decades. Let me begin by pointing out that I'm not an academic specialist of Dante. Whatever I know about Dante, I've learned from teaching Dante and from the work of my esteemed Berkeley colleague, Albert Ascoli, and from Patricia Parker, who now teaches in the English department at Stanford and who was one of my own first teachers. That's what I learned from, whatever I know, I learned from them, so I can blame them for whatever I'm going to say. Moreover, my position is a somewhat modest one in this company. I'm a professor of literary studies who's worked a lot on the period after the appearance of the Divine Comedy in Italy and elsewhere. So I come to the meeting as someone who thinks a lot about the shapes of history and about how books are remembered and transformed across time. This theme of being transformed across time and of remembering Dante, which is the occasion for us here today, is not only relevant to the anniversary of Dante's death, it's relevant to any reading of the Divine Comedy, because I've been teaching the Inferno this fall, and I've been struck by how obsessed everyone in the poem is with being remembered. People ask, Dante meets these people in hell, and they say, remember me, remember me. When you get back up there, remember me. Say something about me. And there's some people he says, you bet I'm going to remember you. And there's other people he says, I'm not going to remember you. For example, the neutrals, the ones who never took a position, remember this, those of you out there in Washington, the ones who never took a position are never remembered because we're told that they're not worth remembering. So that's the situation. Memory is everywhere in the Divine Comedy, so it's good that we should be talking about memory today. So I'd like to begin There it is. I'd like to begin with a moment in the most influential poem of the 16th century in Europe. This is a romance epic by an Italian poet named Ariosto. There he is. Called Orlando Furioso, which was first published in 1516 and then in its full version in 1532. So I'm going to tell you the story from the Orlando Furioso. 3/4 of the way through the Orlando Furioso, we follow the adventures of Astolfo, who is an English duke who rides around the planet on a hippogriff, which is a winged horse. And he's able to go wherever he wants to on this winged horse. And he also has a magic horn that is so loud it drives away all of his enemies. And he also has a book of spells that protects him if he has any problems. So he's fairly well equipped. And here he is on his hippogriff, I think, yes. So about 2/3 of the way through the poem, we find Astolfo flying around in Africa. And he visits Ethiopia, where he meets the famous Christian king, Prester John, and he drives a flock of harpies away from the king's court, and he follows them to a base of a mountain, where we are told the Nile has its source. And there he finds a cave. He sticks his head into the cave and stops and listens, and he hears a terrible noise, and I'm quoting Ariosto now, obviously in English. He heard the air rent with shrieks and reverberating with sobs and endless wailing. A clear sign, says Ariosto, that this must be hell. Astolfo decides to venture in, but he doesn't get very far. The smoke that irritates his eyes stops him from moving forward, and the stench becomes unbearable. He suddenly senses a shape swirling through the air around him. He draws his sword and swings at it. It calls out to him, identifying itself as the soul of Lydia, the deceased daughter of the king of Lydia. Who knew there was a place called Lydia, but I guess there is. Lydia reveals that she has been condemned to dwell here for eternity, engulfed in stench and smoke. Her crime was to have been cruel and unfeeling towards one of her boyfriends, who was faithful in love with her. Lydia adds some explanation, and I quote, "This cave is full to infinity of people like myself, put to the same torture for the same offense. Right next to her is Daphne, who spurned the advances of Apollo, as we remember." After Lydia finishes the tale of her folly, Astolfo tries to venture further into the cave to see who else is nearby. And I quote again, "But the dense smoke that punished ingratitude so swelled before him that it prevented him from making another step forward." So instead of going any further into hell, Astolfo hustles back out, plugs up the entrance with a rock, takes a bath in a nearby spring, hops on his hippogriff, flies up to the top of the mountain, where he lands, where else? In the earthly paradise. There he meets St. John the Apostle, who sends him on a mission to the moon to retrieve the wits of the great hero Orlando, who's Furioso, who's gone mad over his love for the unfaithful Princess Angelica. Well, you can see the literary joke here, right? Ariosto takes all of Dante's poem, Inferno, Purgatorio with the earthly paradise, and Paradiso with the moon, and stuffed it into one episode of his own poem. Instead of walking laboriously through the afterworld, accompanied by Virgil, and interviewing the damned and the blessed, Astolfo takes the express lane. He flies around, making stops here and there. And perhaps most striking, the character he meets in hell isn't an adulterer or a suicide or a traitor, but an excessively chaste maiden whose crime is to have refused to have sex with her boyfriend. Ariosto swallows Dante's entire poem, turning the famous gate to hell into a hole in a hillside in Africa, and reducing the wailings of the damned to a set of stories about ungrateful women who won't sleep with their lovers. Now, I begin with this episode because it suggests the problems raised by Dante's poem for the literary culture of Renaissance Italy. Renaissance and early modern literature are obsessed with the question of the afterlife of poetry. Poetry during this period doesn't only talk about the world, it talks about other poetry, and it often builds itself on earlier poetry. For example, it was not unusual for poets to build their works by simply expanding on the works of other poets. For example, Ariosto himself, whom I just quoted, built his poem onto the end of an unfinished poem by another poet called Boiardo. Others chose to break up earlier poems and dramatize episodes from them. Sometimes poets will create allegories of earlier poets, revealing to the reader that those earlier poets didn't actually mean what we thought they meant. This is what happened to the famous lyrics of the Italian poet Petrarch, which were imitated across Europe, but reinterpreted all the time. For example, the French poet Ronsard argued that Petrarch was a poet in bad faith, since he was obviously a very smart guy, and nobody could be so stupid as to write poetry to the same lady for 30 years without getting her into bed. The problem with these literary strategies of accommodation is that Dante's poem resists them all. You can't expand on the Divine Comedy because it's watertight. It's complete in its structure. There's no Divine Comedy 2, right? The Empire Strikes Back. You can't do it, right? You can't allegorize it because it's already an allegory, and it's already always talking about how allegorical it is. And you can't break it up because every scene is tightly woven into a theological structure. Ariosto probably does the only reasonable thing you can do with Dante, which is to make fun of him, because you can't beat him at his own game. My argument tonight will be that the best place for us to go to think about Dante's incredible influence on Italian culture is not, in fact, to literature. I want to talk about three moments where Dante's presence is Dante's presence is elsewhere, and I want to talk about 3 moments where we can find Dante's influence. The first is in an area that might surprise you. It involves I'm a scholar, I like this. It involves the scholarly practice of commentary. This is not something we pay too much attention to anymore because it's work done by, well, scholars. But in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, when the public for poetry was very small, that public was also in some measure the same public as the public for learned commentary. And indeed, Dante's poems sparked a massive tradition of commentary. Kip and I were talking about this earlier. It sparked a massive tradition of commentary as early as Boccaccio, who gave a series of public lectures in the 1370s, covering the first 17 cantos of the Inferno. And one of the fun things about Boccaccio's commentary is that he explains Dante's language, making it clearer than it is in the original, as if it were difficult to grasp, as if it were incomprehensible already only 50 years after his death. Probably the most famous of these commentaries was by a scholar called Cristoforo Landino, who was a member of the Academy, the famous Academy of Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence in the 15th century. So he was a poet, scholar, and a philosopher. He was famous as one of the major figures in the Renaissance of Platonic thought in Italy. So there was this turn to Plato in the 15th century, as Plato began to be resuscitated and began to replace Aristotle as the great ancient philosopher. Landino wrote an allegory of the Aeneid, which he reinterpreted as a story about the journey of the human soul toward God. He commented on Petrarch as well. And in 1481, he presented a Dante commentary to the Florentine Signoria, that is the city council, in a lavish ceremony. The book was reprinted 7 times by 1500 and 9 more times by 1600. Landino works through the poem line by line, offering a moral and grammatical commentary. And this is the commentary on the first few lines. As you can see, the commentary outweighs the text itself, as is often the case with those scholars if you give them tenure and funding. Here's another version of the same text in a much more lavish edition, as you can see, with an illustration, or with an illumination. And here's a picture of Landino himself, painted by Botticelli, with Federico da Montefeltro, the famous condottiere, and you'll see that it's Federico, who's the guy with the great nose, who has the book, and that's Landino talking to him, right? Because of course all these humanists were basically advisors to these kind of thugs who kind of ran the city-states, whom we would call princes, but basically they were thugs. Okay, Landino promoted Dante as a patriotic Florentine. He tried to resuscitate his good reputation, and a vernacular author embodying Florentine traditions. His long introduction gives us a sketch of the author's life and provides an account of the origins of what he calls poetic furor, the inspiration of the poet. And he has a long discussion in the middle of the commentary called What Poetry Is, What a Poet Is, and on the ancient and divine origin of poetry. In other words, what might seem to be a scholarly exercise, a very pedantic exercise of commenting on the poem line by line and word by word, generates a kind of essay, a kind of philosophical essay that helps to create Dante's authority as a great figure worthy of philosophical contemplation. No less worthy of mention is the commentary of another writer named Alessandro Vellutello in the early 16th century. And there are a bunch of these commentators, but I'm just picking out the most famous ones. He published a commentary on the Commedia in 1544, which was accompanied by 87 engravings that adhere closely to the details of the poem and to Vellutello's Esposizione. He was also the author of a famous commentary on Petrarch. So here's one of the illustrations from the Vellutello text. Now, my point here is a very simple one, which is that through such detailed textual commentary, scholars and philosophers develop their own ideas about poetry and expand commentary into a kind of philosophical literary criticism. This is, in some sense, the beginning of modern literary criticism and literary theory, coming out of this very detailed, very pedantic, line-by-line commentary tradition. So even if Dante is not imitated by other poets, he's commented on by scholars in an important way. So that's my first point. My second point is to think a little bit about Dante's use of language. As you know, Dante wrote a book in Latin in praise of the vernacular. George was talking about Dante's interest in Italian language earlier. And in that book, the De Vulgari Eloquentia, he speaks of the importance of the vernaculars, the languages that we imbibe with our mother's milk, as he says in a famous formulation, and of their dignity in the creation of poetry. He moves across different versions of the Italian spoken in different cities, measuring them against an ideal of what he calls the illustrious vernacular. Now, all of this is fine, but it runs smack up against the strictures of the literary culture that emerges at the beginning of the Renaissance. Already as early as Petrarch, Dante's near contemporary and the next generation after him, already as early as Petrarch, there had been the beginnings of a shift away from the vernacular as the vehicle of linguistic excellence. When the humanists of the late 15th and early 16th centuries look for models of eloquence, their models are precisely not Dantean, because they are looking for models in Latin. Right? Pietro Bembo, the famous humanist who was the kind of authority on good language and good linguistic usage, had no use for Dante. It was Cicero, the Latin rhetorician, who emerged as the king of good linguistic style, just as Virgil took the prize in poetry and Livy took the prize in history. In the deeply classical culture of Renaissance humanism, with its emphasis on Latin eloquence, on civic virtue, and on the elevation of language to high topics of philosophy and philosophical sublimity, Dante's mixed language, his Tuscan vernacular, and his comedic sensibility were out of place. And it is only later, in the middle to later years of the 16th century, in other words, at the end of the Renaissance and the beginnings of what we might think of as the Baroque period, that Dante's style gets rehabilitated. There comes a flurry in the late 16th century of writing about the good style in Italian. This is after the rediscovery of Aristotle's Poetics, and there's a whole kind of debate around what the best way to write is. And the figure who is important in the rehabilitation of Dante is the late 16th century Italian poet, the great poet of the Counter-Reformation, Torquato Tasso. Here's the young Tasso, looking very happy and handsome before he went mad which he did later in life. He was a very tormented guy, as you know, or may know. Anyway, Tasso was the poet who tried to bring ancient ideals into line with modern poetic practices. And we should not be surprised to find that he turns to Dante as a stylistic model. He writes a poem, an epic called The Jerusalem Delivered, Gerusalemme Liberata, about the First Crusade, which tries to imitate classical models in Italian. His best defense of Dante comes in a 1587 text called The Art of Poetry, a kind of piece of critical text. And there he divides all poetic style into three categories. There's a high style, he says, which is the style of the ancients, an epic. Its goal is to inspire us to virtuous actions. There's a low style, which is the style that comes out of everyday life. Its purpose is not to inspire, but to teach. It's the language of comedy. Between these two registers, like Goldilocks' porridge, says Tasso, is the mediocre style of writing. It takes from both the high style and the low style. It puts pressure on them, subtly lowering the high style and raising the low style into a kind of what he calls a sweet style that has a sweet temperament, a suave temperamento. It is this style that is most adept to describing the world accurately, says Tasso. It places before our eyes those things that the poet sees. The middle style is not about hearing, he says, it's about seeing. It's the style for poets who see the world clearly. He says it's not about hearing, but about seeing. Non di udirla, ma vederla, he says. The use of the middle style is born from what he calls an accurate desire to describe things minutely. This, he says, is characteristic of Italian generally, but it's especially characteristic of Dante, in whose work it happens almost magically. And he quotes a passage that is obviously one of his favorites, since he cites it in many places. And this is the description in Purgatory, Canto 3, of the excommunicated, whom Virgil asks to come forward and provide information about how to get up the mountain of Purgatory. And I quote Robert Durling's translation here. And this is a Dantean epic simile, right? We're familiar with these kinds of things in poetry. He says, the little sheep come forth from the fold by ones, by twos, by threes, and the rest stand timid, their eyes and muzzles to the ground. And what the first one does, the others do, pressing up against it if it stops, simple and quiet, and they know not why. So I saw the head of that fortunate flock, in other words, one of the excommunicants, come forward, then shameful in face and modest in walk. So that's a little quotation from Dante that Tasso loves. He quotes it all over the place. This beautiful simile of the souls in purgatory as sheep leaving the fold is, for Tasso, the perfect instance of the middle style, the best style in poetry. It is appropriate to the description of things in the world. Almost, we might say, it points ahead to the kinds of descriptions that will later become, in literature, the province of the novel. It requires a close observation of objects, of things in the world, and the ability to describe them accurately in language. This, says Tasso, is what Dante's language does almost by itself. Quasi da se stesso, he says. For Tasso, this is the best style, and it is in no small measure through literary critical analysis of the type that Tasso gives us that Dante's influence continues to be felt in the Italian Renaissance. That is, to sum up my second point, it's not as a narrative or an ethical vision or a fabulous tale that Dante continues to influence Italian culture, but as a stylist, as a precise craftsman of poetic language who can practice this perfect middle style. Let me stop and take a drink of this wonderful water. Having just taught the Inferno, every time I take a drink of water, I think about those poor guys burning down there. Anyway. But I want to emphasize one other thing that I quoted Tasso saying about, one thing that I quoted Tasso saying about Dante. This was that the middle style in poetry is linked to visuality, to the ability to put things before our eyes. Dante is great because he is an observer, says Tasso. He looks. And this brings us to my third point about Dante's presence in the Renaissance, which is, of course, in the realm of the visual arts. We moderns are accustomed to thinking about the Dantean journey as deeply visual. The first complete English translation of the Divine Comedy by Henry Francis Carey in 1814 was called simply The Vision. We're familiar with Gustave Doré's illustrations, which adorn many of those early editions of Carey, and we're familiar with William Blake's remarkable illustrations to sections of the poem, which preoccupied him during the last years of his life. Closer to Dante, we must turn, however, to Michelangelo first. We know that Michelangelo loved Dante and wrote poems in his praise. We also think that he possessed a copy of the Landino commentary that I mentioned above. And sure enough, in the lower right-hand corner of The Last Judgment, there is a detail that can only have been taken from Dante. So unfortunately, I forgot to do a whole thing of the Last Judgment, but it should be familiar in everyone's mind of this kind of massive thing in the Sistine Chapel. And in the lower right-hand corner, we get this boat, which is the boat of Charon, crossing the Styx with Minos the judge on the shore. Right? Minos is the judge of the underworld. And you'll remember that in Dante, Minos winds his tail around himself as a way of passing judgment. If he winds it 3 times, that's good. That's not good. If he winds it 5 times, that's really not good. If he winds it 7 times, you're in really big trouble, right? Michelangelo seems to go one better than Dante's own description by giving Minos a snake as a belt, which is really great. And piled on the boat are a number of miserable souls. And above the boat, we see a winged figure there who appears to be Geryon, the demon who helps transport Dante and Virgil at one point and helps carry people around in hell. Down in the very lower right-hand corner, and this is something you can't see, but you'll see it now in my next detail, there are 2 ghostly heads, one gnawing on the other. This is the head of Ugolino and Bishop Ruggieri from Cantos 32 and 33 of the Inferno. These are 2 souls frozen in the lake of Cocytus as traitors, and they're condemned for all of eternity to chew on each other's heads. And here they are right here. There's one of them, one up here and the other one chewing. Fantastic stuff. So the presence of this unmistakably Dantean moment in Michelangelo's giant paintings has raised many interpretive problems for art historians. Some art historians say, well, if Michelangelo supposedly believed in a real physical hell, why did he put these details, which are taken from Dante's fiction, in the picture of the Last Judgment? So there's a whole big art history debate around this, which I won't go into. But yes, have you lost me?
No.
Have I lost myself?
We're losing your head.
Sorry, I bumped myself because I tend to get jumpy when I talk too much. Okay, so we can see the close proximity between Dante's gift for observation, which Tasso pointed to, and the role of the artist as an observer of the material world. Right? These emblematic figures are bundled together and provide a kind of condensed version of the Inferno, right? This is the whole story right here. There it is. They come from different moments in the narrative, but Michelangelo jams them together as if he's asking us to remember everything that comes in between these powerful figures. And when we remember that the people standing closest to this in the Sistine Chapel would have been clerics, we can imagine that Michelangelo's Reader's Digest evocation of hell might have a very pointed goal. But finally, if Michelangelo's vision of Dante's vision is emblematic, we might want to turn to a no less powerful but less easily graspable engagement between Dante and the world of the visual arts. I have here in mind the remarkable set of illustrations provided by Sandro Botticelli to the Divine Comedy. We know that Botticelli spent considerable time working on the Divine Comedy. There was, of course, a tradition of manuscript illustration. These are the Simonists. I love this illustration. This is from a very early manuscript illustration. But Botticelli attempted something different. He provided an extraordinary map or chart of the Inferno, which he prepared for a lavish codex of the Commedia commissioned by Lorenzo Pierfrancesco de' Medici, the cousin and ward of Lorenzo de' Medici. Botticelli began to work on these in the mid-1480s and finished them 10 years later. This was a big deal and was seen as such. In fact, Giorgio Vasari, the famous art historian, in his Lives of the Painters, says that Botticelli wasted so much time working on this project that all of the rest of his affairs fell into disorder. Now, this is the one sort of major completed image, is the one called the Infernal Gulf, which provides a map of sorts of the Inferno, right? And you can see there in the upper left-hand corner is where the entry is, and we follow Dante through every one of the circles of hell down through the bottom. You can get this online, by the way, as a poster. I've recommended this to some of my students. I think it's a perfect kind of poster for a dorm room in college. You can get it for about $19.95 online, so I recommend it. But I should also say that here is the text of the Botticelli illustrations. This was reproduced in 500 numbered copies by the Vatican a few years ago. They didn't send one to me, but the illustrations are these illustrations are divided. Some of them are in the Vatican Library, and some of them are in the Staatsgalerie in Berlin. They're sort of half and half. And you can see that we get the text down below, and up above we get these remarkable remarkable illustrations that Botticelli put together. This is the first one. This is the dark wood, which is not very easy to read. But you can see, so we get sort of so it's in this cartoon sort of way where we get Dante taking different kind of steps. And here he is where he meets Virgil. These are the famous the three beasts that he meets: the leopard and the lion at the beginning, and the wolf, I guess, at the beginning of his descent into hell. This is the city of Dis, the city of the infernal city, where Dante and Virgil go through this archway. And it's where they come into the presence of the heretics. And the heretics spend eternity in these kind of heated coffins where they're continually basically roasted. And Dante there meets, in one of the most famous episodes in the Inferno, he meets Farinata, the heretic, with whom he has a long argument, in fact, actually about Florentine politics. And here's just Farinata calling out to Dante, "O Tuscan," he says, "O Tosco." He recognizes Dante by his speech, "who travel alive through this, the city of fire." While speaking in so courteous a fashion, this sound erupted from a coffer of stone, says Dante. And here he is. Here's the more elaborate version. Once they get inside, and here Dante and Virgil, and then Dante steps forward and has a long discussion with Farinata, who's being cooked in the heated coffin. Here's one of the most, so this is just to give you an idea of the incredible, this is not a very good image of the incredible detail with the steps down from one circle of hell to the other. Here is one of the most completed images, which is Dante and Virgil speaking to the flatterers. And the flatterers are guys who bathe in, are people, souls who bathe in. And Dante has an elaborate conversation with them, with one of them. Here we are, this is another version of that same image. And, oops. Yes. This is what Dante says. This is the Pinsky translation. "I saw deep down in the fosse people immersed in filth that seemed to drain from human privies. Searching it with my eyes, I saw one there whose head was so befouled with shit you couldn't tell which one he was. Layman or cleric." I love it. "Looking at me, he howled. And why are you so greedy to look at me when all of these are just as filthy? I called. Because of memory, there's that idea of memory. If memory serves me properly, I saw you once when your hair was dry before. I know you are Alessio Intermine of Lucca." Anyway. And finally, here are a couple of images. Yeah, there they are again. Finally, here are a couple of images. These are the giants that take Dante and Virgil down out of hell. This is an image of, okay, this is just just talking about the giants, and I'm just hurrying because I don't want to overgo my time. This is when Beatrice arrives, and she has a little great sort of cart that's pulled by animals, and this is Dante and Beatrice going up Jacob's ladder in paradise, and this is one of the last of the images as they float up into the Empyrean to see eventually God. So to conclude, I've been suggesting that Dante's preeminent presence in Italian culture, at least in the Renaissance, is communicated not through imitations of the poem or attempts to expand it or rework it or allude to it. Those approaches were foreclosed from the outset. Rather, Dante is everywhere and nowhere. He persists in the practice of scholarly gloss, in debates about literary style and language, and in the visual culture of the day. But I'd like to conclude my talk by venturing for a moment outside of Italy. One of the truly strange things about Dante's influence is the relative paucity of references to Dante outside of Italian culture during this period. Ariosto was everywhere in Europe. Leonardo da Vinci was internationally known. Dante, much less so. To discuss this phenomenon would require, of course, another talk, but I could end with a word about France, which is something I know a little bit about. There's a story told about the first Valois king of France, Francis I, or François Ier, who came to power in 1508. Francis was, along with Henry VIII and Charles V, one of these lusty, charismatic Renaissance princes that we always think about. He was an ardent lover of all things Italian. In fact, he loved Italy so much that he invaded it twice, trying to capture Milan, unsuccessfully. And instead, he settled for hiring Leonardo da Vinci and Benvenuto Cellini to help him with his various projects in France, which is, as you know, where Leonardo died. The story goes that Francois was being read to one evening after dinner from, you guessed it, Dante's Divine Comedy, so one of the few mentions of Dante. In Canto 20 of Purgatorio, among the avaricious, Dante meets Hugh Capet, the revered king of medieval France. Capet identifies himself. I was the son of a Parisian butcher, he begins, figliuolo fui d'un beccaio di Parigi, before going on to elaborate how he ruthlessly seized power. The King of France, we are told, found this description of his ancestor, described as the son of a butcher, so insulting that he ordered the book to be closed. And that was the end of Dante at the Valois court. Indeed, we could paraphrase Dante's own famous adulteress, Francesca da Rimini, though for different reasons, when she says to Dante, "That evening we read no further." Thanks very much.
Tim Hampton, UC Berkeley professor. Wonderful talk on Dante.
Thank you, George.
So one little comment while Kip sets up his program. Dante's poem was called just the comedy when it got started. Now, you wouldn't think that it was that funny. I mean, Tim made it funny, but it wasn't that funny a subject. But the comedy meant anything with a happy ending, basically, and tragedy, anything with a sad ending. And I guess you can count, being in God's presence, which is the end of the comedy, as a happy ending. So that's why it was called the comedy. But later on, it was another commentator who put the word divine on it. So it came later, sort of the same way that happened to Bette Midler. All set?
I'm ready.
Okay, Kip Krana, the dramaturg emeritus of San Francisco Opera, to tell us how it influenced music.
Right, thank you, George. Thank you. Great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to have Humanities West back in action. And yeah. I'm pleased to be on this program with these two very distinguished professors of comparative literature from Berkeley and Stanford. And I have to say, as a disclaimer, I claim no such expertise, but I do know a bit about opera. So what I hope I can do in the next 25 minutes is to hopefully point out some interesting connections for you between the world of Dante Alighieri and the world of opera. So let's plunge right in. The Dante-Puccini connection is specifically what we're talking about. Puccini, of course, the beloved composer of operas like Manon Lescaut and La Bohème and Madame Butterfly and Tosca and Girl of Golden West and Turandot and various others. But the piece we're going to talk about right now is one that is named for a character that is mentioned in the Inferno, and that is Gianni Schicchi. You've all seen this image. We were looking at it a little bit earlier, and I think it's kind of interesting to just refresh our memories about everything. There he is holding up the Divine Comedy, and we've got the gates to hell over here, and we, of course, have his beloved Florence, from which he was exiled when he wrote all this. And here we have the Mountain of Purgatory and its various levels, and then up above, the concentric spheres of heaven. The actual incident where we hear about Gianni Schicchi is in the Inferno, Canto 30. I like this little illustration here of the levels of hell and Dante's sort of priorities here. Of course, at the top we have limbo, then lust. That's only in the second level, so I don't feel so bad. Gluttony, greed, anger, heresy, violence. And here in the 8th circle down is fraud, almost the worst of the worst, but the worst of the worst is treachery. So we're in the realm of fraud here in the 8th circle of hell. Dante tells of singers who are condemned to tear at each other with their teeth, the falsifiers of other people's persons. And here is a quick little summary of what Dante tells us in this section of the poem. Dante is visiting the eighth circle of hell, guided by the Roman poet Virgil. As you know, Virgil takes him through both the Inferno and Purgatory. Suddenly, two spirits, Gianni Schicchi and Mira, both punished as evil impersonators, that is to say, falsifiers of persons, run rabid through the pit. Schicchi sinks his teeth into the alchemist Capocchio's neck and drags him away like prey. Mira had disguised herself to commit incest with her father, King Cinyras, I think it's Cinyras, while Schicchi impersonated the dead Boso Donati to dictate a will, giving himself a profitable request. Here is an image we saw in the sort of pre-show, which is Capocchio, the alchemist who was a friend of Dante's, we think, in his school days and was burned at the stake for alchemy. Here he is in this painting by Bouguereau, having his neck bitten into by Gianni Schicchi. And in the background, you see there is Virgil wearing the red, and then Dante with his laurel accompanying him. Here's the actual moment in the poem where we get all this. And before we read the English, let me point out something interesting about the Italian. It's in what we call terza rima, which is to say that there are three-line stanzas, and it's ABA, but the B from stanza 1 becomes A of stanza 2, and so forth. So it's ultimately it's ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, FED, FEF, and etc. You get the idea. So here we have ando, iki, ando, that's our ABA. And I've skipped a few stanzas, but here we have enne, orma, enne, and then orma, ati, orma. So you see that this orma, which was the B rhyme, becomes the A rhyme in the next tercet. Anyway, here we go. And the spirit from Arezzo, that is to say, Grifolino d'Arezzo, who was a sinner mentioned in Canto 29, who falsely claimed that he could achieve flight and was burned as punishment. The spirit from Arezzo, shivering where he was left, told me, that monstrousness is Gianni Schicchi. He runs rabid among the others here and graces them like this. He goes on to describe Mira, who disguised herself to make love to her own father. We don't have time for that story right now. Drawn to her father beyond what's honorable, she engaged in sin with him by falsifying herself as someone else, and Schicchi as well, who runs off yonder, counterfeited. When trying to acquire the finest lady, that is to say the mare of the herd, he pretended he was Boso Donati dying. All right, that's our mention of Gianni Schicchi in Dante. Now, there are various members of the Donati family mentioned in the Divine Comedy besides Boso Donati, and it's probably because he was related to them by marriage. We've already talked about Boso Donati the elder. There's also a Boso Donati the younger, grandson. We won't talk about him either. There's Forese Donati, a great nephew, we think, of Boso. And there's Nella Donati, Forese's wife. There's Picarda Donati, Forese's sister. There's Corso Donati, a politically powerful brother of Forese and Picarda. And I should mention that Corso is not actually mentioned by name, but he is unmistakably the person his brother Forese describes in Purgatorio as being, quote, the one who is most to blame. Now, the interesting thing is that these siblings, Picarda, Corso, and Forese, were all cousins of Dante's wife, Gemma. So he was related to these folks. There's an interesting relationship between Forese Donati and Dante from their youth. They exchanged in a verbal joust called the Tenzone, which consisted of a series of playful sonnets, 3 pairs of sonnets that they published, in which they exchanged insults. Dante accused Forese of being a bastard and a glutton, and Forese is in Purgatorio, in the area reserved for gluttons. He accuses him of being economically challenged, a spendthrift and a wastrel, and sexually inadequate, unable to please his wife. This, of course, could be construed as a grave insult towards his wife, because it suggests that she is somehow sexually insatiable. So in his youth, he was casting around a few aspersions. Forese, on the other hand, accuses Dante of being the son of a usurer, that is to say, a greedy moneylender, too cowardly to avenge an insult to his father, and so poor that he's going to end up in a hospice founded by the Donatis. So, ouch, that's a real insult. Here's one of Dante's insults to Forese Donati. Young Beachy, that's what he calls him, son of I don't know who, short of asking my lady Tessa, you've stuffed so much down your gorge that you're driven to take from others. So this grave accusation of gluttony is what ends him in Purgatorio as far as Dante is concerned. Here's a depiction of Forese in Purgatorio. There he is. And here is, of course, Dante accompanied by Virgil. He meets the emaciated and almost unrecognizable Forese on the 6th terrace of Purgatory, where gluttons are punished for being forced to starve in the presence of food. Dead 5 years since 1296, Forese attributes his rapid progress through Purgatory to the prayers of his wife Nella. This is the woman he insulted in the Tenzone by inferring that she was sexually insatiable. So this is Dante in later, older age, making amends to Nella, who is alive, and this saintly, devout woman is praying for her husband and getting him through the levels of Purgatory. Dante asks about Forese's sister Picarda and learns that she is now in paradise, and he will later meet her there. Forese predicts the coming death of his brother Corso and his descent into hell. So Corso, not a big friend of Dante, and he's going to end up in hell. Here's a little bit about Corso. A powerful and ruthless Guelph, George was telling us about them, these pro-papal partisans. He formed the faction known as the Black Guelphs, who were pro-nobility. And he was opposed by the White Guelphs, which was Dante's group, who wanted to exclude nobles from some public offices. He abducted his sister Picarda and forced her into marriage. He was exiled from Florence in 1299, regained power with the help of the Pope, and forced many of his adversaries into exile, including Dante. So being related to Corso didn't help Dante at all. As you see in this illustration there, he was called Il Barone. Here is the Torre dei Donati in Florence, the Donati Tower. And interesting, here's a little plaque in the Piazza Donati in Florence, which quotes this passage in the Purgatorio where Forese refers to his brother. Dante says, "The place where I was put to live," that is Florence, "is stripped of good more and more each day and seems disposed to perdition." Forese responds, "The one who is most to blame, i.e. his brother Corso, I see dragged behind the tail of a beast down to the valley of no absolution." So we know that's where Corso is going to end up. Here is a picture of him fleeing his enemies in 1308. The story goes that he fell off his horse while he was fleeing and was impaled by his enemies. There's another depiction of this same episode. Here is a picture of Picarda Donati kidnapped from the convent of Santa Chiara, where she was a nun, and ordered by her brother Corso to marry Rossellino della Tosa. What a name. I think that's going to be the name of my next pet. Rossellino della Tosa. This was all done for the political advantage of the family. So what a guy that Corso was. Here's a bust of Picarda, looking very saintly. No wonder she ends up in paradise. And here is Dante with Beatrice. As you know, Beatrice accompanies him through paradise. Virgil does not. And here he's meeting Picarda. There she is, the nun. And with her is Queen Constance of Sicily. All right, let's talk about the Dante-Puccini connection now, because we've learned about what Dante says about Gianni Schicchi and also about his family. But there's not enough detail there to really make an opera plot out of, especially a comedy. And for that, we can turn to this guy, Pietro Fanfani, an Italian philologist, who published an edition of the Divine Comedy in 1866. And in it, he included, in his appendix, a commentary. We heard from Tim about all these commentaries that came out in the centuries after Dante's time. And this one was by an anonymous Florentine of the 14th century, as you see there, Anonimo Fiorentino. And here's what he says. Gianni Schicchi was famous for his imitations of other people. His friend Simone Donati asked him for help with Simone's rich, childless, widowed uncle, Buoso Donati. At Simone's request, Schicchi sneaked into the bed of the deceased shortly after his death, called a notary, and, posing as Buoso, dictated a will in favor of Simone. Although Dante says that Schicchi used this golden opportunity only to bequeath himself a prized mare, Anonimo Fiorentino says that over Simone's protests, he willed himself 600 florins and Boso's prize mule, telling Simone, "I know what Johnny Schicchi wants better than you do." All right, so this is the basis for the story that Puccini is able to use in his opera Johnny Schicchi, which is part of a triptych, a three-opera evening called Il Trittico. The first is Il Tabarro, the Cloak, which is a slasher, jealousy, murder. Then there's Suor Angelica, which is a sentimental tragedy with a religious underpinning. And then there's the comedy, Johnny Schicchi. It premiered at the Met in 1918, but Puccini was unable to be there because this was just a month after the armistice and the Atlantic was too full of mines. This was the librettist, Giovacchino Forzano, who took this germ of an idea from Dante, which was expanded by Anonimo Fiorentino, and turned it into a libretto. And of course, this is a comedy, so it has to have a love story. So he added one in. Here's a quick synopsis. The Florentine Borso Donati has died, leaving his considerable estate to a monastery. His greedy relatives, deeply shocked, reluctantly accept young Ranuccio Donati's advice and ask the help of Johnny Schicchi, a well-known local rogue, whose daughter Lauretta is Ranuccio's sweetheart. Borso's body is removed and Schicchi takes his place in bed, impersonating him so well that even his doctor is fooled. The delighted relatives call in a notary so that Donati can dictate a new will. To their outrage, Schicchi wills much of Borso's wealth to himself, but they dare not speak up because, as Schicchi pointedly reminded them before agreeing to this scheme, banishment plus losing a hand awaits anyone who participates in falsifying will. If you know the opera, he's going like this, Addio Firenze. That's a warning. That's what happens if you get caught doing this. So when the notary departs, Schicchi chases them out of his newly acquired house, except for his future son-in-law, Ranuccio, and the lad's bride-to-be, Schicchi's daughter, Lauretta. All right, I'm going to show you clippings from little video clips from 4 different productions by 4 different directors, all coincidentally in modern dress, which is, of course, very typical nowadays. If you've been to see Fidelio at San Francisco Opera, which is running right now, that's in modern dress. It's very much the thing. But I think with Johnny Schicchi, it's really a timeless situation, isn't it? Relatives squabbling over a will. Nothing antique about that idea. This little clip is actually directed by Woody Allen. These are the relatives reading the will, which they've just discovered hidden in the house. And to their dismay, they see that Borso Donati has left his entire estate to the monastery. That theme we heard just at the end there is the theme of the will. Da dee da da dee da 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 da. That's a little motif of the will. We'll hear it a lot in the opera. Here is Ranuccio's aria, and I'll give you the setup for this. Young Ranuccio suggests that his family ask the advice of his sweetheart Lauretta's clever and resourceful father, Johnny Schicchi. In fact, the young man has already had Schicchi sent for. If Schicchi can help solve the problem of the will, Ranuccio and Lauretta can afford to be married. His relatives respond in scorn. A Donati could never marry the daughter of a peasant. Besides, Schicchi's not a native of Florence, but from the countryside. Ranuccio responds in praise of both Florence and of talented newcomers like Schicchi. This is the wonderful tenor Francesco Di Muro. Here is Ranuccio. If you're observant, you'll notice a bust of Dante in the background. Here's Ranuccio's aria.
Avete torto, e fine, astuto, ogni malizia di leggi e giudici, conosce sa, non leggiato,
just to stop for a minute to say that was the theme of Johnny Skiki, which we'll hear several times. Ya-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa. Ya-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa-pa. You can listen for that as we go on.
È Gianni Schicchi che la prepara. Gli occhi furbi illuminanti di suo strano viso, ombreggiato da quel suo gran nasone che pare un porracchione per così. Vien dal contado, ebbene, che vuol dire? Basta con queste mie grette piccine. Firenze come un albero fiorito, che piazza dei signori a tronco e fronde, ma le narici forse nuove portano dalle convalli limpide e feconde. E Firenze germoglia in alle stelle, salgon palagi, saldi e torri Anno prima di correre alla voce, cantava Giando piazza Santa Croce, e il suo canto è sì dolce, sì sonoro, che a lui son scesi ruscelletti in coro. Così scendan bidotti in arti e scienze a far più ricca e splendida Firenze. E di Valdel s'aggiù dalle castello, ben venga Arnolfo a far la torre bello, e venga sotto dal Mutel selvoso, i medici mercante coraggioso. Basta con gli odi grechi e coi ripicchi, viva la gente nuova e Gianni Schicchi! E lui
So the relatives aren't buying it, but he's already there. Johnny's knocking on the door. So what can they do? All right, now the moment you've all been waiting for. This is probably why you came here tonight, is to hear O mio Babino Caro. So we'll hear it. Schicchi's offended by the Donati family's disdain for him as a plebeian and an outsider. He's from the countryside, not Florence. So he refuses to help them. You'll hear him say, niente, niente, I'm doing nothing for you, until his daughter Loretta pleads her case. We have Sally Matthews as Loretta and the wonderful comedian Alessandro Corbelli as Schicchi, coming straight out of the ancient Commedia dell'arte tradition.
Oh mio Babino caro, mi piace bello, fondere porta rossa, ma con
Renuccio comes forward there with the will to sort of emphasize the point. You've heard this on the radio, you've heard it in commercials, you probably heard it in movie soundtracks. You might have assumed it was just a real love aria, but it's actually kind of a veiled suicide threat. All right, here's a little bit of the moment. Well, this scene goes on quite a long time, but this is just a few seconds of the scene where Schicchi impersonates Boso and dictates a new will.
Grazie.
Alla gita I poteri di figli. Grazie, grazie. Abbetto di capi caro.
Grazie, cognato.
Annella ed aggherato i peli d'empoli. Grazie, grazie. Cerca ed amarlo. I beni a quintole. Lascio la casa di Firenze al mio caro devoto affezionato amico Gianni Schicchi!
He's already given himself the mill and the mule, now he gets the house. All right, here's our final scene, and we have yet another production here as Schicchi has chased all the greedy relatives out, except for the two young lovers, and they're having a moment before he wraps it all up with a reference to Dante.
Lauretta mia, staremo sempre qui. Guarda, Firenze d'oro, Fiesole bella. La mi giuro stiamore, chi chiesi un bacio, il primo bacio, tremante bianca, le gespile viso. Firenze
Ditemi voi, signori, se i quattrini di Buoso potevano finir meglio di così. Per questa bizzarria m'han cacciato all'inferno. E così sia. Ma con licenza del gran padre Dante, se stasera vi siete divertiti, concedetemi voi l'attenuante.
There you have it. That's the connection between Dante and the opera.
So as we do at Humanities West and also the Commonwealth Club, if you have any questions, you can write them out on the cards, and we'll have a Q&A right after Marissa is done. And so that's one thing. If you are watching this as a live stream online, you can also just write into the chat room question, and we'll try to answer those as well. So Marissa Galvez is here to speak about when Dante was young, before he became Dante. You know, when we have any famous people, right, we always think of them, especially if they lived long enough, to be old, and Benjamin Franklin's always old, but he was a young man once. Dante was a younger man once too, and we only have these busts with him being 80 or 60 years old and severe having written this, but he wasn't always that way. So Marissa, tell us what the young man was. Thanks.
It's kind of hard to go after opera, but I'll do my best. I'd like to thank Humanities West for this lovely invitation. I'm really delighted and honored to be here. And my title says, Dante before Dante became Dante. I could have easily made this title Dante before Dante, but I really wanted to emphasize that Dante is always in a state of becoming, as you heard from the first lecture, the importance of reception and how commentaries and Renaissance art kind of made Dante. And then in opera, even today, Dante is referenced in so many ways, so a part of Florence. Even my students today are, discovering Dante all the time. So I really think of Dante is always in a state of becoming. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per un salva scuola che la diritta via la smalita. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. As we gather here this evening to commemorate the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, we should remember that Dante was always thinking of his life as a journey, where he had been and where he was going. In those first opening lines of the Divine Comedy, Dante, the poet, the pilgrim, finds himself lost in the middle of his life. Suddenly, mi trovai. Dante literally finds himself having lost his way. We can read this as a moral and existential crisis, lost as a political exile from his hometown of Florence, for instance. But I want to dwell on how Dante already reconciled certain things about his identity as a poet by the time he wrote these lines. In fact, I argue that Dante used his skills as a lyric poet to work through issues of love and loss so that he could find his way to being an epic poet of the Divine Comedy, his greatest poetic masterpiece. In contrast to the comedy's poetic form of the terza rima, which you've heard about in the last lecture, that is constantly moving forward, A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, in his lyric poetry, there is a forward and return movement, one that articulates the contradictory feelings concerning love, the movements of the heart, hope, despair, and hope again. If Dante is known in the streets and monuments in Italy as the Somma Poeta, and T.S. Eliot claimed that, quote, Dante and Shakespeare divide the modern world between them, there is no third, end quote. How did he learn to be such an epic poet? And why does this question matter? W.H. Auden declared that, quote, poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings, end quote. I love that. I always tell my students that. It's true. By examining Dante before Dante became Dante, through his lyric poetry and influences before he wrote the comedy, and then his reflection of his past self in the famous theme of the doomed lovers of Paola and Francesca in Canto 5 in the Inferno, we can understand how he used poetry as a clear expression of mixed feelings. He used the form to find a different way to love Beatrice, the love of his life, and inspiration for his works. We would say today that lyric poetry was his form of coping, a way to work out issues of love and his loss of Beatrice. Dante was able to redirect his life and find hope when he was lost in the dark wood of midlife. I always like to tell my students who are 18, 19, and 20 years old, I'm just like, believe you me, you will find yourself there at one point. It comes, no matter what. So here's the trajectory of my lecture. Before Dante, the poet of the comedy, we have a Dante training to be a poet through his knowledge of the troubadours. One can think of Dante as a mature poet by the time he wrote the comedy, one who had worked out certain issues about the kind of poetry he wanted to write. It's not just a question of genre, but what poetry should encapsulate in terms of the worldview, of his worldview and spiritual quests. Through the troubadours, Occitan poets of the 12th century, active in southern France, northern Italy, and northern Spain, he learned about poetry as a craft. In the sweet new style, il stile nuovo, the Italian movement in the late 1200s that nurtured his poetic sensibilities, he imitated the troubadours and then used them to reflect on his love and his loss for Beatrice in La Vita Nuova, or The New Life. Written in the mid-1290s, the Vita Nuova is a story of desire, a passionate account, perhaps true, perhaps invented, of Dante's love of Beatrice from their first chance encounter when the poet was 9 and she was 8 to her death 16 years later. It is also an anthology of lyric poetry, a collection of Dante's earliest verse, assembled and annotated to chart his own growth as a writer. In The New Life, he learns to write poetry in a new style, a poetry that allows his love for Beatrice to help him reach spiritual redemption. She becomes an inspiration for his salvation and his forward movement to God that we see in the comedy. Essential to his growth is his own clarification of how he can surpass the troubadours and develop his own ethics of love embodied in poetry. He needs to surpass the troubadours to move forward, to go from being a lyric poet to an epic poet. We will see this in his treatment of Paola and Francesca in Canto 5, and also in Purgatorio 26, when he meets the troubadour Arnaut Daniel, the poet he has Guino Guinizelli, his fellow poet friend, called in Purgatory Emilio Fabro, the better craftsman. This phrase would forever commemorate the art of the troubadours and was especially made famous by Ezra Pound, who is an admirer of the troubadours and Dante. And on the right, we have Wilhelm's edition and translation about Arnaut Daniel, and he uses it as his title. The evolution of Dante before Dante demonstrates a critical reflection on his view of art. What should art serve? What can it do for me? Should it aid self-deception or help us develop a moral compass? In his treatise De Vulgi Eloquentia that we heard about before in the first lecture on vernacular eloquence that dates to around 1303, Dante argues that Occitan is the proper language for lyric poetry. The troubadours that he cites in the treatise and find mention in the comedy, such as Gérard de Bonlay, Arnaut Daniel, and Bertrand de Born, treat the noblest subjects, rectitude, arms, and love, and serve as models for vernacular eloquence worthy of imitation by the Italian poets. In addition to its sweetness and perfection, Dante attributed much of Occitan's authority to its history as a literary language. Its prestige comes from its illustrious past. Vernacular poets composed first in Languedoc. Languedoil, what would become known as French, is best suited for narrative works. So who were the troubadours and why were they so important to Dante and his formation as a writer? And here's a map from their period of activity. During the extremely brief period from 1100 to 1300, a tradition of poetry took hold in southern France that combined passion and restraint, desire and song, and that still remains part of our cultural heritage. Emerging in aristocratic courts, we can say that this poetry revolutionized the Western imagination. The songs that would become most celebrated were not about war or God, but were dedicated to an inaccessible and unnamed lady, a celebration of an erotic, sensual, and illicit love. It was in the vernacular, Occitan, the Romance language of this area, and most essentially not in Latin, the language of the church and its religious teachings that was written down in manuscripts. The art form was of an essentially musical nature and was perhaps inspired by contemporary religious and popular secular cultures. However, it drew from these cultures to become a distinctive musical and artistic experience as well as a highly cultivated art. As these poets, who called themselves troubadours, were often the spokesmen of their lords, their love songs could also articulate feudal politics and other social agendas. In Occitania, songs about love express the social interest of feudal lords and their concern with status and service. And rather than have songs about douce France, or sweet France, as in the Song of Roland, let's say, and other epics about love, war, God, and King Charlemagne, in Occitania, songs shifted to a focus on douce dame, the sweet lady. She served as the pretext in which nobility could voice their communal social aspirations of nobility and dedication towards a higher good, not God, but the lady and love. Today's scholars consider this episode the beginning of the Western tradition of secular love poetry. Many educated people are familiar with the immediate legacy of these poets, a medieval love tradition that celebrates erotic desire and the figural movements of the heart, later codified in Arthurian romance as courtly love. At its height, this art form developed into a tradition in which the representation of love and erotic desire was bound up with the invention of original melodies using a storehouse of common themes and variations in metrical structures. A dominating element of this poetry was performance. The poet-lover, as a finder of a song, and trobar, after all, means to find, like trouver in French, or tropare in Latin, had to prove himself or herself worthy as a lover, not only as a composer of an original song, but as a performer of that song before a live audience. Let us listen to a song from Bonaventure Ventadorn, one of the most celebrated troubadours. And I think this is really important because this song practice was remembered improvisation and first disseminated as music.
Can vela lausita mover de joy sa salas contra al rai que soblides lais ajazer per la dosur cal cor li vai. Ai, tan granzen ve, amen ve, de que io veia jausion, meraviglia sai car de se, le cor de desirer non fun. Ai las tan cuidava saber d'amor et tan petit ensai, car eo d'amar non posc tener, celeston japrum non aurai. Tot mammo corre, tot mamme, e se mes esse tot l'omon, e can sem tolc nom laeset re, mas desirere car volon.
Okay, go back to that. So in this song, and the song continues, but I just gave a little bit of a clip. So in this song about illicit desire, the conventional nature opening, that includes a lark rising, articulates the desire to experience the fullness of being in love. Yet the poet realizes that he does not have that experience and envies those who have this love, and enveia. And so the song proceeds with efforts to tame and discipline that envy of others who are in love, of frustrated desire. The repeating metrical theme and rising and falling melody in each stanza embody those movements of the heart. He is left with nothing, right? Nom laeset re, but that dispossession creates the song. And re has got a negative construction, but you can think of it as a res in Latin. It means a thing, and the thing is the song, right? One could also start to sense how such vernacular, secular lyric was in dialogue with religious lyric of the time, which also articulates a yearning for God, a ritual lament of deprivation. Further, Occitan's proximity to Arabic culture of the South in the early 12th century comes through in the similar monophonic musical structures and themes of longing for an inaccessible, worthy love object. While Dante would later critique such poetry as being solipsistic and ethically problematic, a self-perpetuating desire for desire that goes nowhere, we need to remember that the ethic of what the troubadours called fin amour, or refined love, had a positive dimension of self-improvement. The lyrics speak of a striving for a worthy love object to make oneself better, because to love in such a proper way is to civilize oneself. Here's an example of a troubadour poetry that captures the concept of fin amour. It is an excerpt from another song from Bonaventure Ventadorn, the most celebrated troubadour active in the 12th century. And I will recite it in Old Occitan so you can hear the rhyme and the rhythm. Non es merveilla suchan, mels tu nul outrageantadol, que plus mitral cos vassamol, el me suifais a so coman. Col e cor se saber e sen, e forse podel e ames. Simtila vassamol offres qui vas ultra barch no mainten. Of course, it's no wonder I sing better than any other troubadour. My heart draws me toward love, and I'm better made for his command. Heart, body, knowledge, sense, strength, and energy, I've set all on love. The rain draws me straight toward love, and I cannot turn toward anything else. So the Occitan is interesting. If you know, Catalan is very close to Catalan. Of course, it's very close to Italian in pronunciation. In this song, he explains how finamor, true refined love, makes one a better person, even if that love is inaccessible. One willingly submits oneself to that ideal, and this is about an erotic desire that's not just lust, but a desire for perfect love. You discipline that want and you transform it into something beautiful and good, such as a song, and this is what makes you a true troubadour. Notice here that the head does not rule the body, but rather the troubadours sing of a cross-sensory wisdom, heart, body, knowledge, sense. By the time Dante wrote his Latin treatise on vernacular eloquence, he would have likely encountered the troubadours in 13th century Italian songbooks or chansonniers such as this one, where the lyrics are grouped under an author with a vita or biography that explain the circumstances of the troubadour's life and occasions for writing poetry, all drawn from his lyrics. Notice how there's no music transmitted, which is the case for most chansonniers. The troubadours had enough cultural prestige to be collected in luxurious manuscripts, but they were transmitted as lyrics without musical notation. Dante admired and respected the troubadours for their poetic craftsmanship, but he had a problem relating to their ethics of fin amour. In the New Life, the narrative about his life, his love for Beatrice, we see him writing troubadour lyrics as a way to explain his frustrated love for her. The simplified plot of the New Life is as follows. One day in church, the young boy first sees Beatrice and is smitten. He spends his youth preoccupied with her, never speaking directly to her, but contriving chance encounters. 9 years pass from this first sighting, and he sees her on the street in Florence, dressed in white with 2 other older women. She turns and greets him. Joyfully dumbstruck, he goes home and dreams of her. Time passes. Dante pines. He contrives a so-called screen love, modeled on the practices of troubadours and romanciers. He selects another woman as the public object of attention. When this woman leaves Florence, Dante finds another, but he treats her with such obvious attention when Beatrice passes him one day, she publicly avoids him in the street. And this is this famous image by Henry Holiday shows that. Now, shaken to the core, Dante writes a poem for her and continues to reflect in verse on love and loss. He considers a shift in his poetic themes from anguish to elation, but is blocked. Dante writes a poem for her and continues to reflect in verse on love and loss. He considers a shift in his poetic themes, but from anguish to elation, but is blocked. Then, while walking by a stream, he blurts out the beginning of what would become one of his most renowned lyrics, Donne qu'avete intelletto d'amore, ladies, you who can understand love. Eventually, Beatrice dies suddenly, and he eventually moves past mere physical desire to embrace the power of the Spirit and the vision of salvation. Now, in this poem, we see the overpowering force of love. Whatever might restrain him dies from the mind, so powerful and overwhelming is the desire to see her. And then he sees her and dies. A certain thought began to oppress my mind. Since you become so ridiculous looking whenever you are near this lady, why do you keep trying to see her? And to this another thought replied, saying modestly, if I did not lose my wits and felt able to answer her, I would tell her that as soon as I call to mind the miraculous image of her beauty, then a desire to see her overcomes me, a desire so powerful it kills. It destroys anything in my memory that might have been able to restrain it, and that is why what I've suffered in the past does not keep me from trying to see her. Moved by such thoughts, I decided to describe what happens to me whenever I'm near her. Then I wrote the sonnet which begins, whatever might restrain me. So he's writing a narrative about the circumstances of composing this verse. And so then he says in the lyric, whatever might restrain me, when I feel drawn to see you, my heart's bliss dies from my mind. When I come close to you, I hear love's warning, unless you want to die, run away now. My blanching face reveals my fainting heart, which weakly seeks support from where it may. And as I tremble in this drunken state, the stones in the wall I lean on shout back, die. Now, but Dante comes to a new kind of verse in Ladies, You Who Can Understand Love, a verse that reveals a new way forward. I began writing a canzone, used this beginning, and I constructed it in a way that will appear below in its divisions. The canzone begins, Ladies who have. Ladies who have intelligence of love, I wish to speak to you about my lady, not thinking to complete her litany, but to talk in order to relieve my heart. I tell you, when I think of her perfection, love lets me feel the sweetness of his presence. And if at this point I could still feel bold, my words could make all mankind fall in love. The mind of God receives an angel's prayer. My Lord, there appears to be upon your earth a living miracle proceeding from a radiant soul whose light reaches us here. Dante transformed the poet's gaze upon the image of the inaccessible lady into a narrative about his move to a new love of salvation. Ladies who have intelligence marks a shift to the new style, the style of her praise. His love for Beatrice remains a physical, historically irreducible and particular love, but now he locates his source of his happiness in that which cannot fail him, that which even death cannot take away, his ability to praise her. He must redirect his longing to that transcendent part of her with which he can be reunited with God that may indeed serve him to lead him to God. And so this will be important for the comedy, right? Because Beatrice is that instrument, that guide who can lead him to God. Even around the time of his exile, we see him still writing poetry about how love is an overriding force that dominates reason and free will. Dante's study and imitation of troubadours such as Arnaud Daniel culminates in the Rime Petrose, or Stony Rhymes, a series of 4 poems directed at a stony lady, Petra, who frustrates the poet's desire. As in the New Life, Dante tries to find a way to surpass the stoniness of the lady and frozenness of his heart by creating a microcosmic poetics that imitates the most intricate forms of the troubadours, like the sestina, and would decisively influence the comedy. Dante still kept writing sonnets to his friend Cino da Pistoia, such as this one, in which love dominates, makes one laugh and groan, and imprisons free will. Quote what he says, free will was never free, so that counsel loses its shafts in vain there, in that sonnet. Which brings us to the comedy and the doomed lovers, Paolo Malatesta and Francesca da Rimini in Inferno, Canto 5. Dante the Pilgrim encounters these sinners being whirled around like doves summoned by desire in the circle of the lustful. They are together, yet as incorporeal shades, they are condemned to never be physically together, and this is their violent torment. Just as they were driven by carnal desire, submitting their reason to lust, so now they are driven by the infernal whirlwind. In this scene, Dante decisively distanced himself from the lyric poetry of his past. He uses the self-defense of Francesca to demonstrate how the troubadours and Arthurian romance can lead people to deceive themselves. When the pilgrim asks Francesca why she is condemned to this circle, she responds in the poetry of Dante's former self. Quote, love, which is swiftly kindled in the noble heart, sees this one for the lovely person that was taken from me, and the manner still injures me. Love, which pardons no one loved from loving in return, sees me for his beauty so strongly that, as you see, it still does not abandon me. Love led us to one death. Here she speaks the eloquent lyric poetry reminiscent of the troubadours, but more specifically, in order to seduce Dante, the lyric of Dante's poet mentor, Guido Guinizelli, who composed in the sweet new style. But Dante sees through her sweetness how, like every sinner in hell, she refuses to recognize her sin. It's not her fault. It's someone else's, namely love. She repeats love 3 times, and in the end says, love led us to one death. Love always is the reason. Not only does lyric poetry make Francesca avoid responsibility for lust, as she explains how she fell for Paolo innocently one day when they were alone reading, she also avoids responsibility by making the book and reading the story become the active agent. The book made us come together. It wasn't our fault. They never confessed their guilt, the one thing necessary for redemption from sin. Instead, Dante fates, cadi come corpo morto cade. I fell as a dead body falls. Dante falls because he realizes how the poetry of his youth has made Francesca who she is. Her submission of reason to lust and refusal to accept responsibility for actions. We can compare this fall to the Bernard de Ventadorn Lark song, where the rise and fall of desire embodies an ethic of self-improvement, fin amor. In contrast, this fall is Dante's reflection and surpassing of such lyrical desire for a forward path to redemption. And here are more images from the 19th century of Paolo and Francesca. And it's interesting how some artists choose to depict the lovers intertwined, driven by the infernal whirlwinds, like in the Dore one, while others emphasize how they fell for each other while reading. In this one, Dante and Virgil are in the middle, observing the lovers. And if they had to read to the end of the Lancelot romance, beyond the first kiss between Lancelot and Guinevere, which is the scene that Francesca alludes to, they would know that Lancelot brings down the Arthurian kingdom and the lovers are doomed to be separated. Guinevere retreats to a convent and Lancelot to a monastery. So they don't read it to the end, but if they had, they maybe would have learned something, and about love. So that's kind of reading the way you want to. I kind of give this as a story to my students, be like, you can't always read the way you want to. You have to read it to the end, right? So poetic craftsmanship must be undergirded by a free will and reason directed toward the good, meaning a love towards salvation. In the new life, he transforms the lyric poetry for Beatrice, a poetry that sustained unrequited desire, into a new kind of poetry, one that praises the earthly Beatrice, but also the transcendent part of her that helps him move forward toward God. Poetry and the courtly love of romances can cultivate self-deception, as we saw with Francesca. The last stage of Dante's breakup with the troubadours can be seen in Purgatorio Canto 26, where he places the esteemed troubadour craftsman Arnaut Daniel in the company of other esteemed poets. And just before I go on, I just want to show this image, the famous Henry Wadsworth Longfellow translation, where he uses the image of Paolo and Francesca on the frontispiece, which I think is very interesting. Guinizelli's use of the word fabbro to point out Arnaud to the pilgrim in this canto, a word that denotes an artisan working in hard materials such as iron, stone, or wood, references Arnaud's characterization of himself as an artisan, his writing as shaping and filing words, obra elim mots, as he said. Dante indicates that Arnaud must do penitence for his artistic overreaching, his art for art's sake with no moral foundation. As he says, Arnaut turned to, quote, reputation than to truth, and thus he fixes his opinion before listening to art or reason, end quote. But he shows his great admiration for the poet by having Arnaut speak in Occitan. He's refining himself rather than his poetry, suggesting that Dante believes that one can be a great poetic craftsman if that poetry is grounded by the right ethics. In the final analysis, Dante makes a gracious place for his name, a gracioso loco, and places him in a commemorative tomb, the treasury of memory, a proper place for the poetic craftsman he has imitated and now surpassed as an epic rather than a lyric poet. And I always think of this because Dante is the reason why so many people even know about the troubadours is through Dante and Petrarch as well. And it's always, even though I'm not a Dantista, and I always have to know about Dante because this canto in particular, he shows how he praises how he has such great admiration for the craftsmanship of the troubadours, and yet he kind of makes a special tomb for them so that he can surpass them. It's a classic Dante move. Like, it's like, here's your place, now goodbye, right? But then he memorialized them, so that's why we know about the troubadours. So Dante's evolution from lyric to epic poet is a story about growing up and the role that poetry can play in helping us sort through mixed feelings that we experience in life. While we might not aspire to be the kind of epic poet that Dante was and who we still celebrate today, we can aspire to be careful readers of our past and respectful of how art can help us see through our own personal and ethical struggles. For Dante, poetry was a way to cope with loss, with the paradoxical feelings about being in love, and finally as a way forward, working through mixed feelings about the past towards his own conception of self-fulfillment and individual flourishing. We all have our own ideas about poetry, but we can say that Dante, at the very least, makes us careful readers. We would do well to heed his call to the power of poetry if one engages deeply with it. It might seduce us in a negative manner, but can also cultivate spiritual growth and a path to self-knowledge. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marissa, and welcome to Humanities West. That was great. All right, we are going to have a Q&A with all the speakers now. So we have questions. First one goes to Marissa about the idea of the sweet lady. They were wondering whether that was at all related to the Virgin Mary, that was sort of a transformation of the Virgin Mary, who became ever more popular as the Middle Ages went through. Could you talk about that?
Which part, the Dante? Or
Yeah, no, the troubadours. That the troubadours developed this idea about this perfect lady that they weren't supposed to touch, whether that was a secular version of the adoration of the Virgin Mary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And one thing about the troubadours that's important to remember when they talk about that inaccessible, high-born lady is that this definitely was a secular love. It was, even though they might not, it's always an unrequited love. It is something about an erotic desire. But you can see relations to it with this, especially in the late Middle Ages in the 14th century, where there starts to be a cult of the Virgin Mary. This idea that, unlike a God who is very, inaccessible or about like very kind of, how would you say, hard justice. You have Mary, who's always the intercessor that you pray to, right? You might be familiar with the Canticas de Santa Maria, the songs made by Alfonso X. They made this great songbook about how the Virgin Mary intercedes on behalf of the people all the time. And so I think there is something about having a lady there. And also Dante's Beatrice. He could have easily put a more earthly Mary in his story, but he wanted to make it someone particular and someone who really was part of his life. So there is something about this kind of earthly, a lady who's particular, but that becomes a sort of spiritualized divine being that we see even in Dante's treatment of Beatrice as coming, and that sort of relates to the popularity of the Virgin Mary, or the cult of the Virgin Mary that happened all over Europe, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Can I ask a follow-up of Marissa? Because I'm thinking about Italian poetry that the madrigalists used in the late 1400s throughout the 1500s. They're always accusing the lady of being cruel to them.
Cruel.
That's the key word, always.
Crudele. So this is a sort of a turning around of this idea of the worshiping from afar.
Right. And I think the cruelty of the lady, so this is what I meant when I saw the troubadour song tracks the movements of the heart, because the whole idea is that, and this is why it also maps onto the kind of feudal practices, is that how do you maintain your dignity to someone who you have willfully submitted yourself? That could be a lord, or it can be a lady who you see as, I will be of service to you, except I have to maintain my dignity to you, right? Mm-hmm. And so she can be cruel, But then, well, if she's nice enough and allows me to love her and she loves me back, perhaps something can happen. But you're always in this game of whether or not she will give me, will she allow me to be, give me that love or not. And usually it's cruel, but then she can be gentle and kind, right? So it's even in that play of never knowing, of like that courtly game, that is part of the intrigue and part of the excitement that the lyric song tracks. Do you see? So yes, she can be cruel, but then she can be sweet and kind the next stanza, right? So, yeah.
Well, one question was if anybody has any more stories about this Pope that ended up in the deep reaches of hell. And also about that as a result of being kicked out, Dante received a death sentence in Florence, and then we were talking earlier about one of the details. Tim, you want to?
Well, it was he received he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Rome, and while he was in Rome, there was a change of government, as you mentioned, and Dante was a star. I mean, he was a political figure of great promise. He was already a famous poet. I mean, he was sort of, he was the kind of, he was the kind of Frank Ocean or, Kanye West of the day, right? And suddenly everything was taken away from him, and while he was gone, he was accused of corruption and exiled. And, it's important to think about what that meant. There's no FaceTime. And when you're exiled, I mean, there's no Zoom. You're exiled. You're not only exiled from your city and your family, but you're exiled from your language because even as now, but especially much more then, different kinds of Italian were spoken in different parts of Italy. So Dante became a kind of wanderer and bounced around through different parts of Italy. And at one point, the Signoria said to him, "Okay, if you'll admit to your crime, you can come back." And Dante refused to do this because he said, "I'm innocent." And so he died in exile. And you might say the Florentines were foolish not to basically just say, "Forget it, you're famous, all is forgiven, you can come home, Dante. We'll withdraw the charge of corruption." And in fact, they did eventually withdraw the charge of corruption against Dante in 2008. So memories are long in Italy.
That's true. I'm surprised they didn't wait for the 700th anniversary.
Yeah, well, exactly. It would have been much better.
One thing I also just want to add to that, it's because my students always ask, so was Dante especially that scene when he puts the Pope in hell and his heads in a baptismal font, was he pre-Reformation? Is this kind of anticipating the Reformation? I say you have to understand how provocative and how original, and no one ever done this before, to put such important, powerful people and call them out on their crimes and put them in Inferno. I mean, there have been many instances in literary accounts of every man walking through hell and but no one with such specificity of friends, of mentors, of family members, but especially powerful people like the Pope at that time, which just also goes to say that Dante really believed he wanted, the church to be better, and he knew that you had to deal with political problems. To say that the church was not involved, that was just, he said no. He had to give instances of how they were and call them out on their crimes and see how serious that was, especially for someone like the Pope, who's the leader of the church. So it's sort of we take this for granted because we live in a secular age, but I mean, it was really incredible the kind of ways that he, the way that the Inferno is so Baroque and depicts crimes and shows them, the contrapasso, the just punishment for the crime. So to really get in people's minds about the extent to which people, were betraying other people and kind of betraying the world, and that the, society was fraying because people believed in people like clergy and the post, but they were actually complicit in fraud and things like that.
And there's also the sense of the corruption of cities, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
through the Inferno, every city in Italy is pretty much called out as at some point being corrupt. Yeah, I had this idea a couple of years ago, actually, of a board game. In which you could put your favorite Washington politician. And I had the whole thing kind of worked out, and then I floated it to a friend of mine who said, don't bother, really. But Marissa's point, I think, is well taken, which is it's very courageous in a particular kind of way to point to those who are in a sense in power, or who have been in power, and put them in hell. I mean, their family will come for you. I mean, that, you know, as we know in Italy.
Yeah.
It's an interesting written counterpart to the painters who you know, if you donated for their painting, they put you in heaven, and if they didn't like you or they took away their money or whatever, you ended up in hell. It's the artist's only revenge, you know, without any power. Here's a comment to Kip. It's not really a question, but the comment is, now that you've explained the context of O mio bambino caro, can you please take it back? So that
Yeah, sorry about that. It has become iconic outside of its context, and so if you want to keep it outside of its context, that's fine with me.
I mean, I you know, heard it again recently because every year with my daughter we rewatch the Merchant Ivory film. What's it called now? With Helena.
Room with the View.
Yeah, Room with the View, where it's sung, and I had never gotten it until now. I mean, but it's the perfect song for that story.
Yeah, who could resist? I mean, what father could, you know, say no?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. His problem was he had a daughter who sang too well. Here's another question. Was Dante excommunicated for the Divine Comedy or other actions? Now, there is a story about a cardinal who tried to put Dante up for trial for heresy about 8 years after he died, and after he was dead. And what he wanted to do was burn his bones at the stake as a punishment. Okay, so the question is, what was wrong with the imagination of these people at that time that there was so much, cruelty in their imaginations of the people that they didn't like? I mean, what preceded this sort of hellish, way of punishing people, other than the religion itself? Was there? I mean, did the popularity in being cruel go up at a certain time? Does anybody know? I mean, this isn't any of your subject, but you might have come across it. I know that humanity has never been cruel at any other time in history, and therefore it's way too difficult a question to answer.
The Albigensian Crusade was a kind of example of that.
I know. It's just maybe there were people burned at the stake all the time. It was a public, to really, the idea of we are sort of used to like seeing, even when what we eat stuff, but we don't see slaughter, we don't see carnage. We have prisons where things are kind of bodily torture or even animal torture is like kind of a distance from us. And even then, I guess in that period, it was very important, and especially in the medieval period too, earlier, it was very important to have a public spectacle to show an example, to really grip people about the crimes that these people have committed. Like they saw a hanging from a public square, or what happened to Machiavelli, I forget something.
Well,
he was tortured, but then he started to write again.
Machiavelli was submitted to what they call a strappato. They would tie your hands behind you. This was. And they would tie your hands behind you and then attach your hands to a rope and then drop you, so that basically both of your shoulders would be dislocated from behind. It was extraordinarily painful.
But it's also, important to remember that if you believed in hell, maybe you went to Padua and you've seen the famous Giotto inferno of hell. I mean, that's what they really believe would happen to you. And that carries on to even conquistadors who were colonizing the world. They were saving lives because those people would be burned. They didn't think of it as that was bad. It's hard for us to kind of grapple with that, imagine, to real belief that if you were in hell, you would be burned and tortured and kind of roasted in these, you know what I mean? So it's not to the degree that the visible violence that happened in the earthly world had suddenly become more violent. Is that the strong belief in that system, in that kind of that what would happen to you? I mean, you went through life was a struggle, and you cared. It would take the Renaissance to happen. You cared about not the here and now, but the hereafter.
Well,
every moment. And then it had to be stuff with the Renaissance. Where the here and now actually matters.
But even the Renaissance. I mean, I get into this argument with my students a lot. When we talk about the religious wars in France in the 16th century between the Protestants and the Catholics, and my students are sort of going like, what's the big deal? Why were they massacring their neighbors? You know, I mean, they're just Protestants. I mean, it's just a different belief system. And then you say to them, no, they believed that those Protestants, or the Protestants believed that the Catholics, conversely, whichever side you're on, those people were going to suffer in hell for eternity. And if the Protestant boy down the street seduces your daughter and marries her and runs away with her, your daughter is going to suffer for eternity. So you got a darn good reason to go down there with your blunderbuss and, you know, wipe those guys out. So so this is very serious stuff. I mean, this afterlife business. I mean, it's very easy for us to think of it as poetry, but it was very serious stuff.
Yeah.
And we had a program here on American Indian history in out west just recently, and there was she had a great line in the book about a man writing about some Indians that had attacked some settlers and killed the family and had done brutal things. And his line was, he says, anybody who has done such a brutal thing, it's so unthinkable, they should be burned at the stake while they're alive. You know, and you just miss your part of the story. And I think that's a very human thing, and that's a very good way to end the Humanities West program.
Burning at the stake.
We're hoping that this isn't the way we are so much now. So thank you very much for your questions. Thanks for coming and joining us in our abbreviated form. It looks a little bit like Humanities West, quite a bit actually. It was a wonderful job. Thank you very, very much, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
And so ends our reopening of Humanities West. And also, this is another enlightened discussion in the 119 years of the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco.
Wow.
Thank you very much for joining us.